Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read more about Edgar Allan Poe. I got a book here called Poe and the British Magazine Tradition by David Allen, I think, 1969. I'm just going to read a couple things out of here. Chapter 6, Journalism as Art. In the letter he sent around to various writers in 1841 about his own projected magazine, Poe says the finest minds of Europe are beginning to lend their spirits to magazines. Here he is condensing considerably one of the facts of the previous 30 years, aired by the British magazinists themselves. The greatest and men of the age have not disdained to belong to the Brotherhood. Wilson had written, and Bulwer admitted, that the work of the great literary men of the age must be sought in magazines. In an intense young poet forced by necessity to direct his limited energies to journalism, this participation of the great must have encouraged hopes of the fusion of high literary achievement for rejuvenation from the journals. In his letter to T.W. White in 1835, Poe had claimed not only that the first men of England had not thought magazine writing unworthy of their talents, but also that some were very high named, valued themselves principally upon the species of literature. Literary journalism as art. Poe was extremely logical in drawing out the implications of his position. If high art was to be written in magazines, then the forms of conventions of the magazine articles must be given their own aesthetic rationale. The magazine must be seen not as a repository of ephemeral work, but the best of which is really designated for later book publication, but as an art field making its own unique demands upon the writer. This is the theory that, in the early age of Dickens, underlies the recommendation to American writers to intimidate British magazine articles. It explains the glowing panegyrics of the originality and varieties of British magazine writing there in review of the work of the English magazinist James Dalton, the author of Peter Schnook. That's a big long article in my other Poe book. And Poe's early review of the magazine as an art field making his own unique demands on the writer produced frequent echoes of the golden age of British periodicals. We apprehend, the short-lived London Magazine had proclaimed in February 1821 that magazines will soon form the only literature of the country. Writers who were not novelists, like Lamb, Wilson, and De Quincey, had improvised their forms with the magazine particularly in mind, a different procedure, at least in intention, from the latter use of magazines in the first appearance of the book material. And while Bulwer was the novels behind him, could regret that these good writers had dissipated their talents by casting their work in such ephemeral forms, De Quincey defended the forms of Wilson's work, pointing out that the advantageous brevity of the magazine article, the conveniency of work which lie in short and detached papers, that is, in the very state of fitting for reading, the cumbersome nature of books, all of which no doubt provided a justification for his only melancholy of magazine writing. In 1831, Blackwood's was, according to Coleridge, an unprecedented phenomenon in the world of letters, and formed the golden, alas, the only remaining link between the periodical press and the enduring literature of Great Britain. It is in this context, perhaps, that one can understand Poe's views in 1845 that American magazines had as yet achieved little. It was, he asserted, the originality and variety of European journalism, along with permitted him to call the magazine field a very important branch of literature, a branch which, moreover, in daily growing in importance, and which in the end is not distant but be the most influential of all the departments of letters. Critical personalities of art. When American writer, Poe asked in the same article a revision of the early review of Dalton's Peter Schnook, in penning a criticism, ever supposes himself called upon the present his readers with a criticism and something beyond? Who thinks of making the critique of work of art in itself independently of the critical opinions? A work of art such as are all the most elaborate, the most effective reviews of Macaulay. Yet these reviews have been evinced no incapacity to appreciate when presented. The best American review ever penned is miserably ineffective when compared to the notice of Montague's Bacon, and yet this latter is, in general, the piece of tawdry sophistry, overing everything to a consummate in an exquisite arrangement to a thorough and justly sufficiently comprehensive diffuseness, to a matterly disclimaxing of points, to the stylish which dazzles, the understanding which is brilliancy, but no more than the misleads, it is in perspicuity, causing us to distinctly to comprehend that we are fancy, we coincide, in a word, to the perfection of art, to all of the art which is Macaulay can wield, and which are applicable to any criticism that Macaulay could write. I have quoted the passage in full to make it apparent that despite the subordinate derogatory implications of tawdry sophistry and misleads, the tone here is primarily laudatory. What Poe admires and calls the perfection of art is a carefully controlled manipulation of style to produce a particular effect on the reader. If this was a very similar idea of art in that which he had developed with the short story in mind in his Hawthorne Review of 1842, such an aesthetic notion of the critical review might seem to undermine its claim to be either true or untrue, just or unjust, and Poe, uncertain of the passage quote, suggested that he was particularly aware of this. Elsewhere, he changed the emphasis, writing that Macaulay, deeply feeling how much criticism acumen is enforced by cautious attention to the mere rhetoric, which is a vehicle, has at length become the best of modern rhetoricians. But for one side of his critical activity, his personalities, Poe retained throughout his life a primarily aesthetic rationale. When Beverly Tucker in 1835 had questioned the justice of critical assaults like Wilson's on the Cockney Tailor and Poe's on Norman Leslie, Poe argued that the levity was artistically indispensable when the work under their view was too foolish to be taken seriously. However, otherwise, the subject had been treated to do not perceive. And to defend his reply to English in 1848, we find Poe repeating the aesthetic argument. I do not well see how I could have otherwise, replied to English. He is so thorough blatherskite that he has replied to him with dignity, yet he had been the extreme of the ludicrous. I confess to you that I rather like the reply of mine in a literary sense, and do so a great many of my friends. It fully answered its purpose beyond a doubt. Would to heaven every work of art did as much. Poe told Godey at the time of his controversy that he had never written an article upon which I more confidently depend for literary reputation than that reply. His concern for the aesthetics of controversy is demonstrated too when he criticizes Bulwer's letter to the editor of the Quarterly Review, rather unjustly as lacking vigor and wit and showing an utter incapacity for satire rather than on the basis of a degree of faith and fairness, and he seems to have seen his own criticism and fallen into two categories. When in 1845 he selected two representative reviews he sent to R.W. Griswold for an anthology, one was the analytic review of Barnaby Rudge, the other was a critique of the poet Thomas Ward, which he said provided a fair example of the style of his funny criticism. And that leaves magazine fiction of art for another day. There is so much stuff with Poe that he could write and critique all this stuff in 10 years or something. It's just unbelievable. This is just a poem out of one of his more popular short stories called Fancy and Imagination. The description of the Southwood Queen runs thus. Of oh, how fair the shape that lay beneath a rainbow bending bright. She seemed to the entranced fay the loveliest of the forms of light. Her mantle was the purple rolled at twilight in the west afar. Tea was tied with threads of dawning gold and buttoned with a sparkling star. Her face was like a lily room that veils the vestal planet's hue. Her eyes, two beamlets from the moon, set floating on the welkin blue. Her hair was like the many sunny beam, and the diamond gems which round its gleam, and the pure drops of dewy even, that ne'er have left their native heaven. In the Queen of Mab of Shelley, a fairy is thus introduced. Those who have looked upon the sight, passing all human glory, say not the yellow moon, say not the mortal scene, heard not the night wind's rush, heard not the earthly sound, saw but the fairy pageant, heard but the heavenly strains that filled the lonely dwelling. And thus described, the fairy's frame was slight and fibrous cloud that clutches but the palest tinge of evening, and which the straining eye can hardly seize, when melting into eastern twilight shadow, where scarce so thin, so slight, but the fairer star that gems the glittering coronet of morn, sheds not a light so mild, so powerful, as that which bursting from the fairy's form spreads a perusal halo round the scene, yet with an undulating motion, swaying to her outline gracefully. I don't know if there's any more poems I want to read here. Maybe a little bit. It's from the same thing, Fancy and Imagination. Or is it that there lurks indeed some truth in man's prevailing creed, and that our guardians from on high come in that pause from toil and sin, to put the senses curtains by, and on the wakeful soul look in again? The eternal pyramids of Memphis burst awfully on my sight, standing sublime twixt earth and heaven, the watchtowers of time. From those lone summit, when his reign has passed, from the earth forever he will look at last. And again, then there for man no hope, but this which dooms his only lasting trophies to be tombs. And it is not so earth, heaven, and all nature shows. So many become immortal, many unclose, the wings within them wept, and proudly rise, redeemed from earth, a creature of the skies. And here, the pyramid shadows stretching from the light look like the first colossal steps of night, stalking across the valley to invade the distant hills of Porphyry with their shade. And once more, their silence, thoughtful God, who loves the neighborhood of death, in groves the asphodel lies hid and weaves its hushing spell among the leaves. Such lines as these, we must admit, however, are not of frequent occurrences in this poem. The sum of those great beauty is composed of the several sums of the world of minor excellences. Moore has always been renowned for the number of oppositeness as well as novelty, and his similarities and the renown thus acquired is strongly identical of the deficiency in his nobler merit, the noblest of them all. No poet thus distinguished was everly rich ideal. Pope and Copaver are remarkable instances in the point. Similes, so much insisted by the critics of the reign of Queen Anne, are never, in our opinion, strictly in good taste, whatever may be said to the contrary, and certainly can never be made to accord with the high qualities, except when naturally arising from the subject of the way of illustration, and then thus arising, and have seldom the merit of novelty. To be novel and must fail in essential particulars. The higher minds will avoid their frequent use. They form no portion of the ideal and appertain to the fancy alone. We proceed with a few random observations upon Alciphron. The poem is distinguished throughout by a very happy faculty which has never been mentioned in correction to its author, and which has much to do with the reputation he has obtained. We allude to the faculty with which he recounts a poetical story in the prosaic way. By this is meant that he preserves the tone and method of arrangement of the prose relation, and thus obtains great advantage over the more stilted competitors. He has no poetical style, such as, for example, as the French have, a distinct style of a distinct purpose, and an easy and ordinary prose manner ornamented into poetry. By means of this, he is established to enter with ease into details which would baffle any other versifier of the age, and of which Laratime would stand aghast. For anything that we see in the contrary, Moore might solve a cubic equation in verse. His facility in this respect is truly admirable, and this is no doubt the result of a long practice after mature deliberation. We refer the reader to page 50 of the pamphlet now reviewed, where the minute and the conflicting incidents of the descent into the pyramid are detailed with absolutely more precision than we have ever known in a similar relation detailed within prose. In general dexterity and melody of versification, the author of La Rook is unraveled, and he is by no means and at all times accurate, falling occasionally into the common foible of throwing accent upon syllables too unimportant to sustain it. Thus, in the lines which follow, we will have italicized the weak syllables, and mark it as nigh. Already the sun birds, the hark from all the temples, the rich swell, a rush into the cool night air. He also too frequently draws out the word heaven into his syllables, a protraction from which he never will support. His English is now and then objectionable, as at page 26, where he speaks of lighted barks and the Down syndromes, catacrack shoots, making shoots, rhymes, and flutes. Below also at page 6 and elsewhere where the word done has improperly a singular instead of a plural force, but with criticism, and this as somewhat captious, for in general he is most highly polished. At page 27 he has stolen his woven snow from the ventulum textilum of Apuleius. At page 8 he is either himself has misunderstood the tenets of Epicurus or willfully misrepresents them through the voice of Alciphron, and inclined to the former idea, however, as the philosophy of that most noble to the sophists of habitually perverted by the moderns. Nothing could be more spiritual and less sensual than the doctrines we so torture into wrong, and we have drawn out this notice at somewhat too great length and must conclude. In truth, the exceeding beauty of Alciphron has bewildered and detained us. We could not point out a poem in any language which, as a whole, greatly excels it. It is far superior to Lalla Roche, while Moore does not reach, except in rare snatches, the height of the loftiest qualities of whom we have named, yet he has written finer poems than any of equal length by the greatest of his rivals. His radiance not always as bright as some of the flashes from other pens, as yet the radiance of equitable glow, whose total amount of light exceeds by very much, we think, the total amount of the case of any contemporary writer whatsoever. The vivid fancy and epigrammatic spirit, the fine taste, vivacity, dexterity, and the musical ear have made him very easily what he is, the most popular poet now living, if not the most popular that ever lived, and perhaps the slightest modification at birth of that which phrenologists have agreed to term temperament might have been made him the truest and noblest votary of the muse of any age of clime, and it is that we have only casual glimpses of that means diviner which is absurdly enshrined within him. We will leave this for another day. There are more stories in here than I can even relate to. I got a book yesterday. Let me just show it to you. Anyone who's interested in reading about Edgar Allan Poe, as I am, this is the quintessential book on Poe. This is the one you want. Tales of Mystery and Imagination by Edgar Allan Poe with illustrations by Harry Clark. Look at this beast. Okay, this is from 1933. There's one other book like this. It's like critiques of this and that and the other, but that is the cornerstone to going into the Gothic literature. So if you think there's any truth in what I'm saying here, please like and subscribe and have a great day.